Okay, we're going to cut them tenons. But before we do, we need to size up our material. We need 2 pieces that are 5 inches by 14 3/4, 4 pieces that are 2.5 by 14 3/4, and 2 pieces that are 5.5 wide by 14 3/4. Okay, now we've got our material set, we've got a straight line, and one of the things that we have buried down in here somewhere is we've just got a piece that we call extra. You know, just in case we make one of them oopses. And it's a piece big enough to replace any one of these sections. You know, you hope everything goes right, but well, this is woodworking, folks. In case you haven't figured out them oopses, yeah, well, they kind of happen. Okay, we're going to get these cut to size. Again, just ripping on the table saw, and either, in our case, we'll use a chop saw or your miter saw or your miter slide on your table saw. Just make sure everything's nice and square. Get everything cut to length. Now, when you're cutting something to length, it's a good idea to have a stop. Meaning, what you want it to width, or length, yeah, length, got it right. When you're cutting something, what you want to be able to do is to be able to cut one end, then have a stop that's a reference point to cut the other. Meaning, this is squaring that end. By having a stop, measuring and sewing is okay. But when you can set up a dedicated stop that will allow you, and I don't even have this set to length yet, but allowing you to repetitively cut each piece at the same set, this ensures you that every piece is identically the same. It's just a good way of doing it. And you know, this is a miter gauge that has a stop on it. You could just as easily take the one that came with your saw and put a piece of MDF on it with a block out here. It doesn't have to be fancy. But that stop block for repetitive cuts and ensuring everything is the exact same length is important. Okay, let's get them cut. Now before I do this, there's one other thing I want to mention. We're actually going to be using a dado blade to cut our tenons. You know, I've cut them all kind of ways, and it's probably still the fastest and easiest way to do it. And if you don't have a dado blade, we can take multiple passes using a table saw blade. However, one of the things that sometimes, just sometimes, can happen is as we're cutting this, we can get a little bit of chip out on the bottom where the blade exits. We don't like that. So here's what I'm going to do. You know, there's a rule. If it's too wide, narrowing it up, that ain't too hard. If it's too narrow, that's a little harder issue. It's kind of like length. You know, too long is one thing. Too short, a little harder to fix. So, to make sure everything's clean and neat, this 5-inch piece, I'm gonna cut it at 5 1/8. This 2.5, I'm gonna cut it at 2 5/8. And the 5.5, 5 5/8. And the reason for that is, then we're gonna do our tenons, then we'll come back and do a light little cut, top and bottom, to clean it down to our finished dimension. And we won't have any chip out or any tear out, just in case it happens. Again, sneak up on it. Okay, I'm gonna get them cut. We'll be right back. All right, cutting the tenons. Now the first thing, what I've got is I've got a dado blade. Now, one of the things with a dado blade is, I know you guys have seen them out here, they've got these I don't even know if they sell them anymore. They're a wobble thing where the blades, guys, don't go there. Get you a decent stacked dado. And this is one that's adjustable. But in any case, what you want is a good stackable dado. Now what I've got it set up, I'm just a little over 3/4. I don't care about doing all of this in one pass. And I've got an auxiliary fence set up so that I don't damage my other fence. I've got a miter slide setting here, and I confirmed and made sure it's square. Now one of the things I like to do, we talked about that chip out and tear out, is I like to take that marking gauge and go all the way around, just like I was hand cutting them. Again, that cut line. Now what that cut line does is it scores, that's the term, and it shears the fiber on the front of the piece of wood. Helps prevent chip out further. Now this is one of those extras, and it's longer than what we need, but it's at the correct width, or thickness rather. So what we're going to do is we're simply going to use this to get everything set up. Now what I did is I took my square and I measured from my fence to my furthest tooth out to my 7/8 depth, but I want to confirm it. The other thing, the thickness of my tenon is going to be determined how much material I remove from the top and the bottom. Now there's one other thing we want to make sure of, and I'll show you. That's why we want a sample to test with. Let me make a few cuts here and get dialed in. And I'm going to show you what I'm talking about in a minute. All right. You know, all right, see, I'm a little loose. So I'm going to lower this dado blade a little bit. Try it again. A little tight. Now moving this dado blade can just be a matter of just a fraction of the turning it. All right, that's a good fit. You want to be able to tap it in. You don't want to have to beat it in. All right, we've got a good fitting tenon. Again, sliding in nice, but I don't do that. Okay, we're ready to start doing them for real. Now again, we're going to just do the flat sides, and their cheeks or shoulders. You know, I always confuse that, which one's which, but I think this is the shoulder and the top and bottom's the cheek. Or maybe it's the other way around. After 30 some odd years, you don't worry about it. You got the top, bottom, and the sides. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and I'm going to run all of my tenons on the flat side, meaning the whichever it is. Now, one of the things you're noticing, I'm doing 2 passes. Now, the other thing is my hand is not as close to that blade as it appears on the camera. You know, and don't try this, and please, whatever you do, don't try this at a miter gauge. That's just, you're going to get hurt. Don't do it. Now I'm going pretty fast here, and when you do, that's what can happen. The other thing, you notice the first cut, sometimes it'll do that, and that's just because you're taking so much material, the blade is actually trying to push the wood up. So that's why nibbling it away, again, you know, and making that other pass to make sure it's cleaned up is what you want to do. Also make sure there's no debris down here and that your miter gauge is setting flat, as well as your insert. All right, one of the things when you're using a dado blade, the first thing one thing I noticed, and you see I've got another clamp on here. These clamps, I needed to drill and go down deeper because what I was doing was actually taking this fence and twisting it a little bit. And I forgot to mention, check that for square. So I got a clamp pulling it at the bottom, so I'm square. One of the things, ironically, if you're not 100% absolutely perfectly square on this, when you go to cut the tops and bottoms off, oftentimes it will actually do a little slight undercut, meaning cutting away some material you don't want. Here's a trick that I always do. I bumped my fence in about a 30-second. Just very, very little. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back and just simply take a chisel, pare it off. That's simple. And that's going to give me a nice clean fit. The other thing, now I've already set my height, and this is for what will be the 2.5. Right now they're still 2 5/8. And one of the things I want to do is I want to make sure that I'm fitting well everywhere. So I got to take just a little bit more off, and don't worry about fitting this so tight. Give yourself a little up and down wiggle room in case something isn't just so you can move it just a little bit. Okay, now we have to cut for the top and the bottom. Now, remember, we've got our mortise is shorter on the bottom to allow for us to do the rabbet. On the center pieces, that was an even thing, meaning that we took the same amount off of each side. The top and bottom are going to be different. We need to take the same amount off of them as we did the center pieces, but only on one side. And that's going to be what will be our bottom of the top and top of the bottom rail. Then we have to readjust, because remember, we're only 3/8 depth at the top and at the bottom. Be careful you don't get yourself confused. So let's do that. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to hit one side of each piece at this setting. Now, simply using my scrap, my extra piece, I'm going to check for my 3/8 depth. Okay, before we get too far in, let's talk about when it don't all go quite as planned. That happens. One of the things that I've seen happen a fair amount, particularly in an application like this, is that we don't get, you notice our mortises, we're coming in dead center, so we're flush on this face. So we did a pretty good job of getting it dead center. But sometimes that's not the case, and it's a common mistake. So how do you handle it? Well, simply what you do is you do what's called a step tenon. Well, that's what I call it anyway. What am I talking about? When you set your blade up and you're making your cut, make sure that your shoulder here, and that is the shoulder. These are the cheeks. shoulder here, cheeks here, is that when you put it up here, you want to make sure that the depth on this is aligning with the bottom edge of this mortise. That's going to set you flush. And do all of what would be your face of the rails. Then come back and adjust the dado blade height to cut the back side to make sure that it fits the mortise. Make sense? This mortise, it's not as critical that this mortise be in the dead center of this as it is it fits. You know, if you wanted to drop this back to 3/8 and do a stepped or offset tenon, no problem. Just work to the face first. Again, making sure that this lines up with the outer edge of your mortise. And when you do that, you're going to fit. Okay, we're test fitting. And everything is looking good. Now, we know that we're still wide. So we're going to have to do we're going to change the dado blade out and true everything up and get everything where we want. Now, I want to reemphasize, because we want to try to take an equal amount off of each side. That'll keep our tenon in the center of where of our mortar, of where we're going to be putting it. Couple things. When we're doing our fit, that we've already talked about over there, that we took a chisel and we simply cleaned that little centerpiece out here to make sure that we were fitting up nice and tight. Here's a tip, right? Not on the face here, but down here, just do a little back cut. Gives a little bit of a glue relief as well. Make sure everything fits nice and tight. Now, the other thing is, it's a good idea is to have what's called a shoulder plane, or referred to as a rabbiting plane. If you run into a mortise or something that's not just perfect, and you need to tune that tenon up a little bit, you can do it. The neat thing about a shoulder plane or a rabbiting plane is that the blade comes out fully to the side. So it allows you to cut right up to the shoulder. Thus the name. And it's used for truing shoulders. Now you can get little ones, depending upon what you're doing. Now, if you run into an issue to where you're a little too tall, or your tenon's a little long, you simply take a chisel, come back, come in and pare a little bit off. Don't try to hold this up and split it off. Okay? And get everything fitting and ready to go. Now obviously we're pretty close here. We've got one more to double check, but I'm pretty sure we're fitting good. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back again, cut everything to the width that we need. Then we have to cut our rabbets in the back for the tin to lay in. Now while I've got it up, I'm going to mark my backs. Make sure I put those rabbets in the right places. Again, stay focused on your orientation. We'll be right back. Okay, our next step, what we've done, again, we just went back and trimmed everything, took a 1/16 off of each side and brought everything down to our measurements. Now we need to cut the rabbet in the back for the tins. Now to understand a little bit, what I've done here is I'm just simply going to do a table saw. All I did was take one of the scraps and I set my table saw blade so when I come across this area right here above the blade is 5/16. That's going to be our reveal. Meaning when it's setting in the pie safe, that's going to be the thickness of the area from the front to where the tin will be. Now I know some of you still wondering how in the world we're going to get them tins and them posts. We have a plan, so just hang tight. Okay, now, because I want the depth or the width in here to be a 1/2 inch, I've got to be careful because that 1/2 inch is going to be going to the outside of the blade. So I have to take into consideration the width of the blade. So your fence measurement isn't going to do it. You're going to actually physically have to measure it. Now, here's another thing we want to do. We actually want that, I'm at like a 1/2 inch, 32nd or so. And the reason for that is our tins are supposed to be 10 inches. But we don't want to have to take that tin and be trying to get it pushed up in there and everything and bend our edges or anything up. So that little 32nd on both faces is going to give us a little bit of slide room there. Not enough to hurt anything, but that's what it's going to be. Then we're simply going to groove. Now what we're going to do is we're simply going to groove where we need to. Now again, remember, on the top pieces and the bottom pieces, it's only one groove. And that's going to be an easy way to remember. That's going to be at your widest part of your tenon. Okay, on the center pieces, it's 2 of them. All right. All right, with the grooves cut, now what I got to do is I simply got to remove the other, make one more cut. Now what I did, I've set the blade, I set this up against the blade, like so, and I made sure my tooth was just hitting right at the top of the curve. Then I set my fence at 5/16. I ran. Now, the first thing I want to mention to you is don't put, you want the off fall from this to come to the left side of the blade. You do not, when this stick comes off, you do not want it sandwiched in between the fence and the blade. Not a good idea at all. All right, the other thing you want to do is you want to make sure you keep an area clear here in the event the off fall was to throw back. We really can't run a splitter here on this because the splitter's a little bit above the blade. Okay, so this is an area and an operation you need to be very careful with. You also can't put a feather board up against it because if you put a feather board against it, what it's going to do as the stick falls off, it's going to push it into the blade. Exactly what we don't want. Just make sure you have a good anti-kickback blade and you'll be fine. Now, what would an alternative to this be? Very simple. Dado blade, go across, you're done. Ever how you want to do it. Okay? So we're going to finish these, and then our next step is we got to cut some tapers on these posts before we can do a side assembly.